In the shadowed VIP room of Manhattan's most exclusive club, a 20-year-old waitress locked eyes with the city's most feared crime boss. Desperate, she tapped her collarbone twice, a dead syndicate's ghost signal. He froze. The music faded into background noise. In that single heartbeat, her entire world shattered. The Obsidian Room was not a place for the weak. Hidden beneath the bustling streets of Manhattan, just off Lexington and 47th, it was a sanctuary where the city's ultra-wealthy rubbed shoulders with the ruthlessly corrupt. To 20-year-old Sienna Hayes, it was simply a loud, claustrophobic prison that paid just enough in tips to keep the lights on in her cramped Queens apartment. But tonight, the dim, amber-lit corridors felt less like a workplace and more like a trap. Sienna clutched a silver tray of crystal tumblers tightly against her chest, her knuckles white. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was being hunted. For 3 weeks, Mickey Dolan had been circling her. Mickey was a mid-level enforcer and loan shark, a man with a reputation for breaking fingers before asking questions. Sienna's older brother, Leo, had made the catastrophic mistake of borrowing $40,000 from Mickey's associates to fund a doomed startup. When Leo fled the city 2 weeks ago, the debt transferred to the only family he had left. "Going somewhere, sweetheart?" The raspy, whiskey-soaked voice drifted from the shadows near the service elevator. Sienna froze. Mickey stepped into the dim light of the hallway, a heavy-set man wearing a cheap suit that poorly concealed the shoulder holster beneath his jacket. His smile was jagged, a cruel tear across a weathered face. "Mickey." Sienna kept her voice as steady as she could, though her pulse roared in her ears. "I'm working. The manager expects me back on the floor." "The manager knows better than to interrupt my business," Mickey sneered, taking a slow step forward. The heavy thud of his Italian leather shoes echoed in the narrow corridor. "Sienna, you're out of time, Sienna. It's Friday. The interest has compounded. We're sitting at 50 grand now, and my patience is entirely bankrupt." "I don't have it," she whispered, backing up until her shoulder blades hit the cold, mahogany-paneled wall. "I told you, I don't know where Leo is. I'm saving everything I can." Mickey lunged, his thick hand wrapping around her throat, pinning her against the wood. The silver tray clattered to the floor, crystal shattering into 100 glittering shards. Sienna gasped for air, her hands instinctively flying up to claw at his thick wrist. But he was immovable. "I don't care about your savings, little girl," Mickey hissed, leaning in so close she could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You're going to come with me tonight. I know a few private clients out in the Hamptons who will pay top dollar to break in a pretty young thing like you. You'll work off Leo's debt on your back." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Sienna's veins. She thrashed, but Mickey's grip only tightened. Down the hall, she saw one of the club's private security guards turn the corner. For a split second, hope flared in her chest, until the guard saw Mickey, quickly averted his eyes, and turned back around. She was entirely alone. Then, the heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor swung open. The air in the hallway seemed to instantly plummet by 10 degrees. A hush fell over the immediate area, the booming bass of the club's sound system suddenly feeling entirely inadequate to mask the heavy silence of the men who had just stepped into the hall. It was Damien Russo. Even at 20 years old, completely disconnected from the criminal underworld, Sienna knew the name. Everyone in New York knew the name. At 32, Damien was the undisputed head of the Russo syndicate, a man who controlled the shipping ports, a dozen high-rise developments, and a network of violence so sophisticated The FBI hadn't been able to make a single charge stick in a decade. He walked with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit, his dark hair swept back. His sharp, aristocratic features were locked in an expression of utter boredom, flanked by his right-hand man, Silas Mercer, and two towering bodyguards. Damien looked like a king, assessing his domain. Mickey, realizing who was approaching, instantly loosened his grip on Sienna's throat, though he didn't let go entirely. He tried to plaster on a respectful, groveling smile, shrinking into himself. Sienna gasped for breath, sliding down an inch against the wall. She looked at Damien. He was passing by, not even glancing in their direction. To a man like Damien Rousseau, a thug roughing up a waitress was less than an insect on the pavement. He was going to walk right past. She was going to be taken to the Hamptons. She was going to disappear. Think, she screamed at herself. Think, a memory flashed in her mind. A drunken night 3 years ago. Her father, Robert Hayes, a disgraced former NYPD detective who had spent years tracking organized crime before the bottle took his career. He had been rambling about the old days, about the unspoken codes of the real heavyweights. They have their own language, Sienna, he had slurred. The high-tier guys. If a parlay went south, or someone needed immediate, unquestioned sanctuary from a rival, they didn't scream. They used the Corsican drop. Her father had demonstrated the gesture, laughing bitterly at the absurdity of it. It was a dead signal, he said, unused since the brutal Mafia wars of 2014. Desperation breeds reckless courage. As Damien Rousseau passed within 10 feet of her, Sienna stopped fighting Mickey's grip. She went perfectly still, forcing her breathing to steady. She locked her terrified hazel eyes directly onto Damien's cold, dark gaze. With her free right hand, she reached up to her left collarbone. Tap, tap. Then, she dropped her hand, slapping her palm flat against her hip. Damien stopped dead in his tracks. The abrupt halt of the syndicate boss caused his bodyguards to instinctively reach for their jackets. Silas Mercer frowned, his hand resting on the lapel of his suit. Damien didn't look at his men. His eyes, dark and fathomless like an ocean trench, remained fixed entirely on Sienna. The boredom had vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, terrifying intensity. The silence in the hallway stretched, pulling tight as a wire. "Boss?" Silas murmured, stepping closer. Damien ignored him. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his body to face the wall, where Mickey still held Sienna. "Let her go," Damien said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It possessed the quiet, rumbling authority of an impending avalanche. Mickey Dolan practically jumped backward, pulling his hand away from Sienna's neck as if her skin had suddenly caught fire. He bumped against the opposite wall, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The color drained from his weathered face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. "Mr. Rousseau," Mickey stammered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "I didn't mean any disrespect. She owes a debt, a legitimate street debt to the Dolan crew, just handling business." Damien didn't look at Mickey. He took a slow step toward Sienna. She stood frozen, her chest heaving, the red marks of Mickey's fingers already beginning to bruise on her pale throat. She had used the signal to save her life. But as Damien Rousseau towered over her, smelling of expensive bergamot and danger, she realized she might have just traded a wolf for a dragon. "A legitimate debt?" Damien repeated softly, finally dragging his gaze to the sweating thug. Silas. Silas Mercer didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and drove his fist directly into Mickey's stomach. The heavy-set man folded like a cheap lawn chair, collapsing to the floor with a wet, gasping wheeze. Silas grabbed Mickey by the collar of his cheap suit, hauling him up to his knees. "You are breathing my air, Mickey," Damien said, adjusting his perfectly folded pocket square. "And you are laying hands on someone who just claimed my personal sanctuary. That makes her my property, which means you are currently trying to steal from me." "I didn't know," Mickey sobbed, blood beginning to drip from his bitten lip. "I swear on my mother, Mr. Russo, I didn't know she belonged to you." "She does now," Damien stated. He turned his back on the groveling man. "If I see you on my streets again, Silas will ensure you don't have legs to walk on. Get out." Mickey scrambled to his feet and ran, nearly tripping over himself in his desperation to escape the corridor. Sienna pressed herself flat against the wall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. Damien turned his attention back to her. His dark eyes scanned her face, her cheap club uniform, the run in her tights, and finally settled on the red bruising on her neck. "Come with me," he ordered. It wasn't a request. Sienna didn't argue. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to walk, following the broad shoulders of the Mafia boss out the back exit of the club. They stepped into the biting chill of the New York night air, right into a private alleyway, where a gleaming black custom Maybach idled smoothly, flanked by two black SUVs. Silas opened the rear door of the Maybach. Damien climbed in, and Sienna, shivering from the cold and the residual adrenaline, slid in after him. The heavy door shut with a solid, isolating thud, sealing her in a soundproof luxury cabin with the most dangerous man in the city. The interior was immaculate, smelling of rich leather. Damien poured himself a glass of amber liquid from a hidden crystal decanter. He didn't offer her any. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her face. "I am a man who appreciates many things, Miss Hayes," she whispered, her voice hoarse from Mickey's grip. "Sienna Hayes." "Miss Hayes," Damien continued, swirling the liquor in his glass. "I appreciate loyalty. I appreciate ruthlessness. But above all, I appreciate a good mystery. And you, Sienna, are a very interesting mystery." Sienna swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "Thank you for helping me, Mr. Russo." Mickey was going to... "I didn't help you," Damien cut her off, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. "I claimed you. There is a very distinct difference in my world. Now, I want an answer. And I only ever ask a question once." He leaned forward, the ambient streetlights filtering through the tinted windows, casting long, dangerous shadows across his face. "The signal you used back there?" Damien said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "The double tap, flat palm. The Corsican drop, that signal died 12 years ago. It was known only to the inner circle of the old D'Agostino family and a select few who buried them. It is not something you read about on a true crime blog. It is not something a 20-year-old cocktail waitress knows." He set his glass down. The click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet car. "So, Sienna Hayes, who exactly are you, and how do you know the dead man's code?" Sienna's breath hitched. She had hoped he would just dismiss it as a fluke, but looking into his calculating eyes, she knew he wouldn't let this go. Her father's warnings echoed in her head. "Never tell them what you know, Sienna. Knowledge is a death sentence." But lying to Damien Russo seemed like a faster way to the grave. "My father," she confessed, her voice shaking slightly. "He taught it to me. Damien's brow twitched. A microscopic show of surprise. And who is your father? Robert Hayes. He was a detective. NYPD. Organized Crime Bureau. A heavy silence descended upon the Maybach. Damien stared at her, processing the name. Slowly, a dark, chilling smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes. Detective Robert Hayes, Damien murmured, leaning back against the leather seat. The Bloodhound, the man who nearly brought down the entire East Coast operation in 2013, before he mysteriously lost his mind and drank himself into an early retirement. He didn't lose his mind, Sienna said, a sudden spark of defensive anger flaring in her chest. He was set up. Someone planted evidence in his apartment to ruin his credibility. Yes, Damien agreed smoothly. I know, because my father was the one who ordered it done. Sienna's blood ran cold. She stared at him, horror washing over her. She had just begged for her life from the son of the man who destroyed her family. And now, Damien said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. His daughter drops a dead syndicate signal in my lap to save herself from a two-bit street thug. Let me go, Sienna said, her voice rising in panic. She reached for the door handle, but it was locked. Please, I don't know anything else. My brother owes money. I was just trying to survive. Your brother's debt is erased, Damien said casually, waving a hand. I own Mickey Dolan's boss. The $40,000 is gone. Consider it a charitable donation. Sienna froze, her hand still on the locked handle. You paid it? Just like that? I don't pay for things, Sienna. I erase them, Damien corrected her softly. But in my world, there is a concept called omerta, and there is the absolute law of equivalent exchange. I have saved you from a life of profound misery, and I have cleared your family's name from the ledger. You are entirely debt-free to the streets. He leaned forward again, trapping her against the door with his intense presence. But now, you owe me, Damien whispered. Your father knew things. He hid files before they ruined him. Files that belonged to the old families. Files that my rivals would kill to possess. You are going to help me find them. I don't know anything about any files, Sienna protested, tears of sheer frustration welling in her eyes. He died a year ago. He left us nothing. Then you had better start digging through your memories, Sienna, Damien said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Because, as of tonight, you no longer work at the Obsidian Room. You work for me. You belong to the Rousseau Syndicate until I say otherwise. He tapped on the glass partition, separating them from the driver. Welcome to the family, Miss Hayes, Damien said, as the heavy Maybach pulled away from the curb, dragging Sienna directly into the dark, violent heart of a world she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. The Maybach glided seamlessly through the wrought iron gates of a sprawling estate in Oyster Bay, Long Island. The tires crunched over the pristine gravel driveway, the sound echoing in the dead of night. Sienna stared out the tinted window, her breath fogging the glass. The mansion looming ahead was a fortress of limestone and dark glass, surrounded by manicured hedges that looked more like barricades. It was a gilded cage, and the door was about to lock behind her. Damien didn't say a word as the car came to a halt. Silas opened the door, and the biting wind coming off the Long Island Sound whipped Sienna's hair across her face. She stepped out, her cheap, scuffed waitress shoes sinking slightly into the perfect gravel. She felt ridiculously small, acutely aware of the run in her stockings and the lingering, phantom pressure of Mickey's hands on her neck. Silas will show you to your room, Damien said, pausing at the heavy oak front doors. He didn't look back at her. Tomorrow, you begin working for your keep. My men have already visited your apartment in Queens. Everything of your father's, every file, every notebook, every scrap of paper is in the library. Sienna's head snapped up, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by a flare of outrage. You broke into my home? Damien finally turned, his dark eyes catching the amber glow of the porch lights. I expedited a necessary process, Sienna. Your landlord was more than happy to hand over the keys for a crisp stack of hundreds. Sleep well. You'll need a clear head for what's coming. He disappeared into the cavernous hallway, swallowed by the shadows of his own home. The next morning, Sienna found herself in a library that rivaled a museum. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of expensive cigars, old paper, and the subtle, lingering scent of Damien's bergamot cologne. In the center of the room sat a massive oak table, entirely covered in cardboard boxes. They were her father's things, the detritus of a broken man's life. A quiet, older woman named Rosa had brought her coffee and a change of clothes, a soft cashmere sweater, and perfectly tailored slacks that Sienna suspected had been purchased that very morning. For hours, Sienna sat at the table, surrounded by the ghosts of Robert Hayes. There were old NYPD commendations, faded photographs of Sienna as a child, and dozens of spiral notebooks filled with her father's erratic, drunken scrawl. Damien entered the room just past noon. He had traded his tailored suit for a dark charcoal turtleneck and slacks, though he looked no less dangerous. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water from a crystal pitcher on a side table and leaned against the edge of the desk, watching her work. Find anything that can bring down a syndicate yet? He asked, his tone laced with dry amusement. Sienna glared at him, her eyes red-rimmed from reading and unshed tears. I told you last night, he was a broken man when he died. Whatever he knew, he took it to the grave. These are just old betting slips from the Aqueduct racetrack and ramblings about his pension. Damien set his glass down, the amusement vanishing from his face. He walked around the table, stopping just inches behind her chair. Sienna stiffened, her heart kicking into a faster rhythm. He reached over her shoulder, his arm brushing against hers, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. He picked up a frayed, green leather ledger. My father, Vincenzo Russo, was a monster, Damien said quietly, his voice a low rumble near her ear. He was a man who believed that fear was the only currency that mattered. When your father started getting too close to the shipping port operations in 2013, Vincenzo didn't just order him killed. That would have made him a martyr. Sienna turned her head slightly, looking up at Damien's profile. His jaw was clenched tight. He ordered his reputation destroyed, Damien continued, tossing the ledger back onto the table. Planted offshore bank accounts. Heroin taped under the floorboards of his patrol car. He made your father look like the dirtiest cop in the 5 boroughs. It broke his mind. I know this, Sienna, because I was 20 years old, and I watched my father orchestrate it from the dining room table. If you know all this, Sienna whispered, her voice trembling with a potent mix of grief and anger, why do you care about his files? Your family already won. Damien leaned down, placing a hand on the armrest of her chair, trapping her in his space. His dark eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying, magnetic intensity. Because my father wasn't the only one involved, Damien said softly. The D'Agostino family backed the play, and someone high up in the current mayor's office facilitated the paperwork. Vincenzo is dead. The D'Agostinos are dead. I killed them to take this throne. But the politician who helped ruin your father, He's still out there, breathing my air, and secretly backing a rival faction, trying to usurp my territory. Your father knew his name. He hid the proof. Sienna swallowed hard, looking back down at the scattered papers. The stakes were suddenly paralyzingly real. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. This was about revenge. A dark, seductive part of her wanted that revenge just as badly as the Mafia boss looming over her. She reached out and picked up the green ledger. She opened it to the middle pages. It was columns of numbers, dates from 2013, and names of horses. Wait, Sienna murmured, her brow furrowing. She pulled a scratch pad toward her. What is it? Damien asked, his posture instantly shifting to high alert. My dad's a terrible gambler, but he always played the trifecta at Aqueduct, Sienna explained, her finger tracing the columns. He had a system, but look at these odds. They don't make sense. Midnight Runner at 40-1 on a Tuesday in November? The track was closed for renovations that entire month in 2013. Damien moved closer, his chest brushing her shoulder as he looked at the book. Coordinates, not coordinates, Sienna corrected, a thrill of adrenaline cutting through her fear. Locker numbers and dates. But not at a racetrack. Look at the abbreviations. G, C, T. Track 32. Grand Central Terminal. He didn't hide the files. He checked them into a long-term private storage locker under a fake name. Damien stared at the numbers, then slowly looked down at Sienna. For the first time since she had met him, there was a flicker of genuine respect in his dark eyes. Get your coat, Damien ordered, stepping back from the table. We're going to Manhattan. The drive back into the city was suffocatingly tense. The black Maybach cut through the midday traffic on the Long Island Expressway, flanked by the two ever-present SUVs. Inside the cabin, the silence between Damien and Sienna was heavy, charged with a strange, crackling electricity. They were no longer just captor and captive. They were co-conspirators. If this locker actually contains what you think it does, Sienna said, breaking the silence as the Manhattan skyline loomed into view. What happens to me? Damien didn't look away from the window. You go free, Sienna, with a very generous severance package for your troubles. A new identity, a new city, whatever you want. The Russo Syndicate will wipe its memory of you. Sienna felt a sudden, inexplicable hollow ache in her chest at his words. She had spent the last 24 hours terrified of this man, yet the idea of walking away into nothingness felt oddly terrifying in a different way. She pushed the thought down. Survival first. They arrived at Grand Central Terminal. The cavernous Beaux-Arts station was a sea of rushing commuters, tourists, and echoing announcements. Damien didn't bring his entire security detail inside. Only Silas and a heavily built man named Marco flanked them, their hands constantly hovering near the inside of their jackets. Sienna guided them down into the labyrinthine lower levels, past the oyster bar, and toward the secluded corridors that housed the private, long-term rental lockers. The air down here was cooler, smelling of old marble and electricity. Locker 409, Sienna muttered, clutching her father's green ledger like a shield. They found it at the end of a dimly lit row. It was an old, heavy brass door. Damien nodded to Silas. The enforcer stepped forward, producing a specialized lock-picking tool. It took him less than 30 seconds. The heavy brass door clicked and swung open with a rusty groan. Inside sat a single, battered, metal lockbox. Sienna let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Damien reached in and pulled the box out. It was heavy. He set it on a nearby maintenance cart and used the butt of his heavy pocket knife to snap the cheap padlock. He opened the lid. Inside were 3 thick manila folders, several USB drives, and a microcassette recorder. Damien opened the first folder. Sienna leaned in, her shoulder pressing against his arm. She saw official NYPD letterheads, bank statements with redacted names, and grainy surveillance photos. "Son of a bitch," Damien breathed, his eyes scanning the top document. It was Commissioner Rourke. He was the one laundering the D'Agostino money through the city's pension fund. "Your father had it all, boss." Silas's voice suddenly cut through the air, sharp and urgent. Damien snapped the box shut. Sienna turned. At the end of the long corridor, blocking their only exit, stood 4 men. They weren't wearing the sharp, tailored suits of Damien's crew. They wore dark leather jackets and flat caps, their hands openly holding suppressed semi-automatic weapons. "Matteo's crew," Damien growled softly, pushing Sienna entirely behind his broad back. Matteo Russo, Damien's uncle, the man who had been quietly gathering power in the Bronx, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike down his nephew and take the syndicate. He had somehow tracked them. "Damien," the lead gunman called out, his voice echoing menacingly in the tiled hallway. "Your uncle sends his regards. Hand over the box, and we only shoot the girl." "Silas," Damien said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Take the left." Chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. The rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire shattered the quiet of the corridor. Sparks showered from the marble walls as bullets chewed into the stone. Damien grabbed Sienna by the waist, practically throwing her behind a massive stone pillar before drawing his own weapon, a sleek, customized Glock 19. The deafening roar of Damien's unsuppressed gunfire was a shockwave. He moved with a brutal, calculated efficiency, stepping out from cover, firing twice, and ducking back before the return fire could find him. A man at the end of the hall dropped, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. "Marco is down!" Silas yelled over the gunfire, pinned behind a metal trash receptacle. Sienna huddled on the cold floor, covering her ears as stone dust rained down on her. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might break her ribs. She looked to her right. Marco lay motionless 3 feet away, a pool of crimson expanding rapidly beneath him. His gun had slid across the polished floor, coming to rest inches from Sienna's hand. "Knowledge is a death sentence, Sienna," her father's voice echoed in her mind. But right now, hesitation was a faster death. "Damien, I'm out," Silas shouted, frantically slamming a fresh magazine into his weapon. But one of the attackers was already flanking him, closing the distance. Damien was pinned by 2 shooters, unable to provide cover for Silas. He gritted his teeth, stepping out to take the shot, but a bullet grazed the concrete inches from his face, forcing him back. Sienna didn't think. Instinct, raw and desperate, took over. She lunged forward, grabbing Marco's heavy weapon. The steel was cold, slick with sweat. She scrambled up to her knees, leaning around the edge of the stone pillar. The man flanking Silas was 10 feet away, raising his weapon for the killing blow. Sienna aimed. She closed her eyes for a microsecond, prayed, and pulled the trigger. The recoil threw her backward, her wrists screaming in pain, but the booming shot echoed through the corridor. The attacker jerked violently sideways, his weapon clattering to the floor as he collapsed. The sudden, unexpected shot from the flank caused the remaining 2 gunmen to hesitate. It was a fatal mistake. In that 1-second window, Damien stepped out from cover. 2 shots rang out in perfect, lethal synchrony. Both of Mateo's men hit the floor, dead before they realized what had happened. Sudden, ringing silence descended on the corridor, broken only by the sound of Sienna's ragged, gasping breaths. She stared at the gun in her trembling hands, the smell of cordite thick and acrid in the air. She had just killed a man. She had just crossed a line that could never, ever be uncrossed. The room began to spin, the edges of her vision darkening. Suddenly, Damien was there. He kicked the gun out of her hand, sending it skittering away, and dropped to his knees in front of her. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip bruisingly tight, pulling her out of her shock. "Sienna, look at me," he commanded, his voice rough, lacking all of its usual smooth polish. She blinked, forcing her eyes to focus on his face. He was covered in stone dust, a small cut bleeding on his cheekbone, his eyes wild with adrenaline. "You saved Silas." "You saved me," Damien breathed, his chest heaving. He didn't let go of her shoulders. Instead, he slid his hands up, his thumbs lightly tracing the line of her jaw, his touch shockingly gentle in the aftermath of extreme violence. "I killed him," she choked out, a sob tearing from her throat. "You survived," Damien corrected fiercely, pulling her slightly closer. The magnetic pull between them, forged in the crucible of the gunfire, was suddenly undeniable and overwhelming. "In my world, there is no sin in surviving. You are stronger than you know, Sienna Hayes." He looked down at her lips, then back up to her terrified, wide eyes. For a second, the dangerous Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man looking at a woman who had just profoundly altered the gravity of his world. He leaned in, the space between them evaporating. Sienna's breath hitched, her eyes fluttering shut as the heat of his skin radiated against hers. "Boss," Silas's voice, tight with pain, broke the spell. "We have to go. Station security is going to be down here in less than 60 seconds. Damien stopped, his face agonizingly close to hers. He let out a harsh breath, pressing his forehead against hers for one brief, intimate second before pulling back. The cold mask of the syndicate boss slammed back into place. "Grab the box," Damien ordered, standing up and pulling Sienna to her feet with one powerful motion. "We're going to war." The escape from Grand Central was a blur. They didn't return to the estate. Instead, Damien routed them to a secure Tribeca penthouse. Once inside, Sienna wasted no time. She placed the battered metal lockbox on the glass coffee table and pulled out the encrypted USB drive. Plugging the first drive into Damien's laptop, a prompt demanded a 16-character passcode. Sienna closed her eyes, remembering her father's obsessions and his final, desperate days. She typed, "Midnight 409 Hayes 13. Access granted." She opened a folder, labeled The Kingmaker. An audio file from October 2013 began to play. The voices that filled the room made Damien go completely rigid. "Vincenzo is getting sloppy," the first voice crackled. It was Damien's uncle, Matteo Russo. "Arrange the hit on Vincenzo. I'll make sure the precinct looks the other way," replied the second voice, Thomas Rourke, the current NYPD commissioner. "And if the kid doesn't play ball, we use the same leash we used on Detective Hayes. We bury him in his own backyard." The recording clicked off. Damien's face was a mask of pure obsidian. He had believed he seized his empire by outsmarting his father, but he had been manipulated into patricide by the very men he thought he had defeated. "Rourke is hosting the Police Foundation Gala at the Plaza Hotel tonight," Damien stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper. Sienna, can you cast this data to their network? If I get to their server room. Yes, she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 hours later, a black limousine pulled up to the Plaza Hotel. Sienna, wearing a breathtaking emerald silk gown, took Damien's arm. He looked like a dark god in a midnight blue tuxedo. Silas had already infiltrated the private security team, allowing them to bypass the main checkpoints and slip into the opulent lobby. The server room is down the east corridor, Damien murmured, pulling her into the shadow of a marble pillar. I am going up to VIP Suite 412 to find Mateo and Rourke. Upload the files. When it broadcasts, get out. Do not wait for me. He kissed her fiercely, a bruising collision of heat that sealed their unspoken bond, before disappearing into the crowd. Sienna slipped into the cool, humming darkness of the server room. She plugged the USB drive into the master terminal, typing frantically to set up a script that would overwrite the ballroom's audio-visual system. Uploading. 45%. Suddenly, the heavy door clicked shut. Well, a raspy voice sneered. Sienna spun around. Standing in the shadows with a suppressed pistol was Mickey Dolan, his face heavily bruised and his eyes completely unhinged. Mateo said if I brought him the drive, he'd make me a capo. Mickey laughed, raising the weapon. Uploading. 75%. Sienna was out of time. Remembering Damien's words, there is no sin in surviving, she grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher mounted beside the desk. Mateo is already dead, she lied with a cold arrogance that surprised her. As Mickey hesitated, she hurled the heavy metal cylinder directly at his face. Mickey screamed as it connected, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling. Sienna lunged, driving the heel of her stiletto violently into his kneecap. As he collapsed in agony, she slammed the metal keyboard across his head, knocking him entirely unconscious. Gasping for air, she looked at the screen. Uploading. 100%. Execution complete. 4 floors up, Damien kicked open the door to Suite 412. Mateo reached for a weapon, but Damien was faster, driving his fist into his uncle's throat and pinning him against the wall with a Glock beneath his chin. Commissioner Rourke froze by the window, the color draining from his face. Damien, let us be reasonable. There is no negotiation, Thomas, Damien growled softly. At that exact moment, the crystal-clear speakers in the suite and the massive concert speakers in the ballroom below cracked to life. Arrange the hit on Vincenzo. I'll make sure the precinct looks the other way. Downstairs, 300 police officers and reporters fell dead silent as the corrupt conversation blasted over the PA system. Bank transfers and internal emails flashed across the projector screens. That is the sound of your empire burning, Damien whispered to the commissioner. By tomorrow, your own officers will put you in handcuffs. He turned to his trembling uncle. Leave this city tonight, or you die. Damien walked out, leaving the two men in absolute ruins. He found Sienna on the freezing rooftop terrace, watching the fleet of NYPD cruisers swarming Fifth Avenue below. He stepped up behind her, draping his tuxedo jacket over her shivering shoulders. It's done, Damien said quietly. The money is wired to an offshore account in your name. The plane is waiting at Teterboro. You can walk away, Sienna. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing her cheek. But if you get on that plane, it will tear out the only piece of my soul I have left. Sienna looked at the man who had terrified her, and then fought a war to protect her. She had tasted the fire, and she didn't want to run anymore. She grabbed his lapels, pulling him down to her. Cancel the flight. she breathed against his lips. I'm exactly where I belong. Sienna Hayes walked into the obsidian room as a desperate waitress, and walked out as the architect of a mafia war. She didn't just survive the perilous intersection of a corrupt police commissioner and a ruthless syndicate. She conquered it. By using a dead man's signal, she dismantled her family's darkest trauma. She standing as an equal beside Damien Rousseau.